In today's video, I am going to talk about one of the most common mistakes that internal audit makes, and that is escalating findings that aren't material. So, focusing on areas that we have maybe found, they could be wrong, but we are making essentially mountains out of molehills. So we're escalating things, we're talking about things, we're including things in findings that really are not material. Okay. Now, this is coming from a post that I saw on social media, and I'm going to go through and kind of explain some of that because I think the person that posted it really kind of missed the bigger message. And so, when we think about it from a basic risk management standpoint, there's different events that happen, right? And we can either choose to terminate or avoid certain of those events by taking certain actions, or we have to kind of treat and control them after they have happened. Now, in this, often when we are escalating findings that aren't material, the audit client freaks out, flips out, whatever you want to call it. They become defensive. They want to argue. And I'm sure all of you that are listening have had examples in your career where this has happened. You've taken something back to an audit client. They didn't agree with it. They argued with you about it. And really, you kind of got into a fight about it. Now, when that happens, right, now we're in that phase of having to treat or control it. So you have to do things about damage control, about how to, communicate difficult messages, how to repair those relationships that you may have damaged as part of this. And so my point, the bigger point is, wouldn't it be helpful to avoid a lot of those situations to begin with? And to me, I think the answer is yes, right? And that is really one of the key leadership points is if you can actually identify these things and avoid them before they even ever happen. But a lot of times we end up getting in the way and we think, well, we're right, you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you what's what. And when we do that, obviously we start conflict with other people. Now, a lot of people in internal audit, and this post is one, I'm going to get in and talk about that too. When these things happen, we tend to point the finger at the other person and say, they're the one that's wrong, we're right. Now, anytime you point your finger at somebody, you got three fingers pointing back. And what I have found in leadership and in coaching leaders for many, many years now is most of the time when we think the other person is wrong, we're actually the one who is to blame. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in this social media post, and like I said, it's a common mistake. It's a common belief that people in internal audit have. But the gist of the post is, and I've got it kind of pulled up over here, is a person sharing an experience in their career where they found duplicate payments as part of the audit. So they went back to the controller, they explained this, and the controller, to use their words, flipped out, right? Freaked out and said things like, we're spending millions. This is noise. Why are you even looking at this? This has nothing to do with controls. I'm escalating to the CFO and CEO, right? So obviously this person was not happy that this finding was brought up. And again, going through the post, they had kind of a heated argument for probably 45 minutes to an hour about this. And I know, the person, doing the post had good intentions and was looking at it and trying to explain to people, hey, when the clients freak out, relax. It's not your fault, right? And use your good conflict management skills, but realize it's not you, it's them. Now, I understand why people may think that, but remember, I told you when we're pointing our finger at somebody else, there's three pointing back at us. And so in this particular instance, I don't see it as the control, as the auditors were right and the controller was wrong. and I'm going to give you some details on it. So I told you that they found some duplicate payments that amounted to $150,000. Now, I will tell you, in any organization, $150,000 is not material. If you're large enough to have an internal audit shop, $150,000 is probably not material. Now, we can look at it and say, well, can management accept this risk, right? Because that's one of the standards and one of the things in internal audit that a lot of people don't really think about. Well, if the controller can approve or has levels of authority greater than $150,000, that controller can say, I choose to accept that risk. It's not a risk to me. And at that point, as internal audit, we should drop it. Now, like I said, $150,000 is probably not material to this organization. So why is internal audit making a big deal about it? Well, because we think that the organization was wrong. There's an opportunity for them to recover $150,000. Now, I understand, and that is, admirable, for us to do it. But I'm going to talk about maybe some different ways that we could approach this that would be more pleasant for the audit client to accept, instead of us getting into an argument with somebody over this. So if we have found that there are duplicate payments, there's some questions that we need to ask ourselves. What was causing this to happen, right? Is this everything? Because like I said, if we've only found $150,000 worth of duplicate payments, maybe in a whole year, it's not that big a deal. Should the controller know about it? Yes, right? We should pass that information on to them, but we shouldn't make a big deal about it. We shouldn't put it in the audit report, escalate it all the way up to the executives and the board and say, that controller did the wrong thing. They let $150,000 go and they shouldn't have. And so, as we're looking at this, we need to really kind of do a root cause analysis on this. Is this really a control issue or is it not, right? What caused those $150,000 in duplicate payments? Well, if it's a deviation, that was isolated incidents that we can identify, then maybe there's no issue with the controls, right? Now, if we look at it and we see a systematic issue, and maybe there is, something wrong with the controls, if we will, that are allowing this to get through, then we have to start having the discussion about, well, what is the potential overall impact? And like I said, if we've looked at things for over a year or 2-year time horizon and we only found 150,000, the controls are probably working efficiently enough. They're effective enough, right? Because in order to put new controls in place or do other things to try to catch the $150,000, it may not be worth the time investment, right? And so again, these are things that we need to consider. You don't want to spend $200,000 to save $150,000. That doesn't make any sense, right? Would you make an investment? Hey, give me $200,000 and I'll give you $150,000 back. Well, you wouldn't make that kind of personal investing decision. So why would an organization do that as well, right? And so, again, as we start to peel this back, what caused the issue was us escalating a finding that probably wasn't material. And by doing that, and again, this is where you can be self-righteous and feel like you're right. And, there's the old relationship kind of saying that says, do you want to be right or do you want to be loved? Which, again, on its surface, what it really means is, are you going to make a big deal about something that is small? Maybe you're right in doing it, but are you going to make a big deal about it or are you going to focus on the relationship? I think it's more important to focus on the relationship. especially when you're in internal audit. You're dealing with the relationships all the time. So why would you want to make more work for yourself? And again, that's one of the primary purposes why I'm talking about this. It's already hard enough to be an internal auditor, but so why make it any harder by doing things ourselves that cause more stress to us in our work? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I would rather avoid things to begin with. So, how could we approach this differently? Well, like I said, we're doing our work. We've double checked everything. We've triple checked everything, and yep, sure enough, that we found $150,000 worth of transactions that were duplicate payments. So, let's start doing some analysis. How many payments were there? Maybe there were three. Well, three that totaled $150,000, that's probably not a control issue. If it was 1,000 that made up the $150,000, now maybe we do have a control issue and we need to look at that in a little bit more depth, right? To understand, was there really something in the controls that was falling down? And we can start going down the rabbit hole trying to figure that out. For example, were all of the payments done by the same person in accounts payable? Well, now we've isolated it to see maybe it's not necessarily a control issue with all of accounts payable. Maybe it's just that person, and we have a personnel issue, right? We can look at it and say, well, who were the duplicate payments to? If all of the duplicate payments were to the same vendor, now we may have a fraud issue, right? And see, that's totally different. That's a totally different conclusion to make from it. But if it's a few $100s here and there to lots of different vendors, then maybe it is, maybe it isn't a control issue. We need to dig into that more. But like I said, in pretty much any organization that has internal audit, that has an internal audit group, your company is large enough that $150,000 is not material. And so that's why when we escalate findings that are not material, it damages our relationship with others in the organization. Because again, they're looking at it and saying, we spend millions of dollars. This is noise. Why are you dealing with $150,000? We had $2 billion go through accounts payable. And if we only got it wrong for $150,000 of the $2 billion, I think I'm doing pretty good, right? And so put yourself in the place of that manager. Do you think you'd be doing pretty well if you only messed up on 150,000 out of 2 billion? I think you would be. Now, if it's 150,000 out of a million, well, that's different, right? That's a lot different. But again, in any of your organizations, you're processing a lot more than $1 million in payables each year. So we need to stop and put things in perspective, right? And realize, okay, now hold it. Again, depending on the analysis that we've done, again, we've got a couple of conclusions that we may take forward to the audit client. If they were all to one vendor, then we may say, hey, we found these duplicate payments. They were all to one vendor. That leads us to believe that maybe there could be some fraud risk related to that particular vendor that we need to look into more, or maybe you would like to look into more, right? That's a different discussion. If we look at it and we say, hey, they were all duplicates by the same person in accounts payable, then again, you can go to the controller and say, hey, we found these duplicate payments and they were all processed by the same person. So, you may have a personnel issue. You may have an opportunity to retrain the person, fire them, do whatever you want, right? And if we determine that maybe it is a control issue, then we should identify where it seems the controls are breaking down. But like I said, $150,000 worth of duplicate payments probably doesn't mean there's a control issue. And so, instead of escalating it, putting that as a finding, including it in the audit report, here's what I would do instead, right? These are things that are not material. And so instead of including them in the report, you just provide them as information to the controller, and it stops there. Now, I'm saying that making the assumption that the controller has more than $150,000 worth of approval authority, right? And so if that's the case, then the controller can stop it at that point and say, yep, I know it. I'm aware of it. I have, $500,000 worth of approval authority granted to me by the board and by the executives. 150,000 is less than 500,000, so I'm okay with it, right? Thank you for bringing it to my attention. And so, we can approach it in a different way, right? We can talk about, hey, we did this audit. We found $150,000 worth of duplicate payments. This is what we found. Here's the list of them, right? Controller, here you go, right? Do something about it. Don't do something about it. It's really up to you, because we realize that you have the ability to manage and accept that risk. And we're not going to make a big deal about it. We're not going to put it in the audit report. We're not going to go tell everybody else in the organization that you made a mistake, right? Unless, like I said, we feel that it actually is material and actually is a material weakness in our control structure, right? That's different. But as I said, put things in perspective, because $150,000 is not material to any organization. So why would we make a mountain out of a molehill? Why would we want to create more work for ourselves than we need to? I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes to argue and likes to feel like you're right, then by all means, make a big deal about it. But realize that you're going to create a lot more stress and work for yourself if you do that. And it really is okay for internal audit not to escalate things that are not material. Again, even the IA and their standards, they have a standard about management acceptance of risk. And a lot of people forget that, right? But if the manager in the area that you're auditing has the approval level to accept that risk, it should stop there. And we don't need to make a big deal about it. Okay. Now, again, why am I saying this? Because it's already hard to be an internal auditor. And there really is no reason, for us to continue to make big deals out of things that are not. Now, even if we're right, what happens when we do this? We damage relationships. We damage relationships with the people that we work with. We damage our reputation in the organization, right? Because that executive is going to talk to other people and say, oh yeah, audit came in, they were making a big deal about $150,000 deal. I can't believe they were doing that. They were just trying to get me in trouble. They were going after me, right? And that message is going to be shared to other people. Now, how do we know that? Well, because again, if you've had a good experience, let's say in buying a product or service from somebody, do you leave a review? Most people don't, right? But if you have a bad experience, don't you tell everybody you know, right? Because you're mad and you're going to tell everybody you know about this bad situation that you had with this company. Well, that's what happens in organizations too. So every bad experience that we have with others in the organization, they tell other people. And that damages the relationship of internal audit, right? It leads them to believe that internal audit doesn't know what they're talking about, that they're focusing on things that are not material. They're just here to make my job harder, right? And when we do that, it makes it harder for us to do any other work. And I think, again, Internal audit in general is not normally respected in organizations. I'm just going to be honest with you. Some organizations it is. Some organizations truly see internal audit as a value uh, proposition in the organization. But those organizations are usually not focusing on things that are not material, right? They're focusing on the higher risk areas that have a bigger impact. They're working on and having good relationships with people in the organization, with their peers. And that's different, right? Than people who are always making a big deal out of things that probably are not. And so again, it's our own fault, right? You know, when I talk about risk management, what's funny is there's one category of risks called operational risk. And there's a lot of them, a lot of risks underneath operational risk. And what I try to tell people to make it simple is operational risks are risks that arise because of the way we choose to do business. Right? It's because there are risks inherent in the processes and how we're operating our business. Well, the same is true in internal audit, right? And so, you know, take a look at, are you creating risks for yourself? You know, by having these conflicts with other people in the organization when we don't even really need to have them. And like I said, hopefully it's not happening where you are, but I see this happening all the time. And because of the social post yesterday, I just felt like it was an opportunity to hopefully remind everybody, right? To don't escalate findings that are not material. Don't make mountains out of molehills, right? And when we don't do that, right, we're able to be seen more as a valuable, trusted advisor in our organizations. We're not damaging the relationships that don't need to be damaged in the first place. So, uh, penny for your thoughts. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up this video for this week, and I'll see you on the next video.